ทัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ One very commonly asked question in this monastery, and I think in many other Buddhist monasteries and temples, is how to prepare for death. It's one of the things that stay in the back of the mind, stays in the back of the people's minds through their life, and is often set aside because it's put in the too difficult box, too difficult to answer, too stressful, and yet it keeps re-emerging because we often have relatives or friends who are facing death through old age, terminal illness, or we even lose friends, relatives, colleagues to death. So it keeps re-emerging. And that's possibly one of the main roles of any religion, is to help both comfort people with the thought of when they think of death, but also give them some understanding of what is death and how to deal with it. Maybe Buddhists have an advantage here because the way the Buddha talked about birth and death is very much like just a kind of a process. And he talked about samsara, a cycle of birth and death, and this life we lead is not just one-off, but we've had lives before this and have lives after this, although there's no fixed self. He didn't teach that there's this fixed self just kind of moving from life to life. He talked about life and death more as a process, cause and effect. Or the proper word is a process of becoming. We're constantly, our mind and our experience is constantly subject to becoming. And death is really just one stop on this process. So sometimes it's compared to like, say, a journey in a car or a train where you're just going on this journey, or your mind, your consciousness is going on this journey, and you stop here and there for different reasons, and death is just like one stop, and then you carry on after death. Consciousness continues, maybe just in a different place, a new place. We say a new life. It's certainly a valuable subject to think about, and the Buddha encouraged it. The Buddha encouraged us actually to think about death every day. Or Ajahn Chah's version was, every day ask yourself, why was I born? Why am I here? Because when you think about death, it makes you think about life. What's the best way to live my life? What's the purpose of life? Or the more corny one, what is the meaning of life? But just to think about your life is already immensely valuable. Because one of the problems we face as human beings is that we keep going into hibernation mode, and we just go onto autopilot or default mode, and we're just cruising through our life without thinking about it, following habits, behavioral habits, the way we think, act, speak, often without thinking very much or more deeply about what the point of it all is and what we're trying to achieve. We are prone often to just dullness and habit, where our mind turns off and we're not very aware of what's going on. And so that's one reason why people do seek out religious teachers and religious teachings, and maybe come and find Buddhist monks and nuns. They want to get some answers, or at least get reminded of things they may have heard before and appreciate, but they want to get reminders. And as I said, this question comes up every few days in the monastery. Why are we here? What is the purpose of it all? How should we prepare for death? Or maybe a friend, how can we help a friend who's going to die soon, being diagnosed with some terminal illness, or maybe they're very old. There was once, in the time of the Buddha, King Pasenadi was one of his students. And there was one time the king was a bit stressed, so he came to see the Buddha in the middle of the day. I think that was an unusual time. Normally the king wouldn't go and see the Buddha in the middle of the day. He'd be busy doing his things that kings do, his business. But that day he came to see the Buddha, so that alerted the Buddha to the possibility that the king was stressed or something was wrong. And the king was not a very peaceful person, but he was actually quite wise. Like many of the students of the Buddha, he was wise enough to know that he's not peaceful. He is prone to stress, and he knew why. He knew he was stressed because he was a king and he was attached to his power and his wealth and all the people that he controlled, and the kingdom, the land, the wealth of the kingdom. He was very much attached to that, or the word they used in those days was he was intoxicated or drunk with all his power and wealth and privilege. But he was insightful enough to know that, and to know that this was a problem for him, and he wanted to understand better how to deal with that. So he came to see the Buddha. And the Buddha, in typical fashion, launched straight into a reflection for him and said, imagine if one of your trusted officers came from the direction of the east with the news that there's this huge mountain slowly moving towards us here. And it's unstoppable because it's a mountain. Mountains are symbolic of just those forces in the world that are unstoppable, huge, powerful. And then another officer, trusted officer, came from the north and said the same. There's this huge mountain coming our way. It's not going to stop. It's going to reach here and flatten us all. And then a trusted officer came from the west, and then one from the south. So from 4 directions, he's got trusted officers coming and say, we're done for. There's these 4 huge mountains moving our way, and it's only a matter of time before they get here and crush us and destroy us all. What would you do if that happened? And of course, you need a mountain to threaten a king, because not much else will threaten a king. The king will feel confident. If it was just an army, he might have a big army and say, well, I'll just send my army out. Or if it's some other threat, he would maybe have the means to deal with it. But when it's a mountain, and 4 mountains, so there's no escape, then he's stuck. But because he was a student of the Buddha already, he gave the right answer. He said, well, I'd start practicing the Dhamma. I'd start making merit and cultivating the wholesome actions, the path of the Eightfold Noble Path and wholesome action. That's the right answer. And really we all have 4 massive mountains coming our way, because we're all going to die. From day one, when we're born in this world, it's another part of the process. We've achieved birth as a human being, got this body, got this mind, but This process is ongoing. It's not ending just because we want it to end, or slowing down or stopping. And so from day one we're getting older, aging, which at first means growing up, but later it means getting old. And we're subject to sickness, and we're subject to all the uncertainties of living in the world, the ups and downs of life. And that process continues, kind of rumbling on. The journey continues until at some point we're going to face death, and we don't know when either. So how to prepare for that? How to deal with that truth? Well, that's why we practice the Dhamma. So the King Pasenadi gave the right answer, and he had that correct sense of heedfulness coming up when he considered death. And heedfulness is this cover-all quality that the Buddha encouraged us to develop, where we're just aware of, say, the impermanence of life, the impermanence of the pleasures that we love to seek out to kind of stimulate us, keep us happy while we're slowly on the conveyor belt going towards our death. Heedfulness is the wake-up call and the sense of alertness to the dangers and the inevitability of death. The fact that we won't always have this opportunity to practice. So the king had that, he had heedfulness arise, so he was a student of the Buddha and he went away and carried on practicing. We have to do that every day. This is one reason we listen to the Dhamma, is to remind ourselves or make ourselves heedful to the truth. Listening to the Dhamma, especially from wise teachers, or the word of the Buddha, is an invaluable part of our practice. We call an enlightened student of the Buddha a savaka. So someone like Luang Por Chah, who we consider to be an enlightened monk, he's a savaka. Even you can say savaka Buddha, because we assume somebody who's reached the end of the practice, they've abandoned greed, anger and delusion from their mind, they've reached Nibbana, they're an arahant. They've actually attained the same Nibbana as the Buddha. So they've attained arahantship, Nibbana, but we call them a savaka Buddha, in the sense they're enlightened, but they're a savaka. They've listened to the teachings or the words of the Buddha as an important or an essential factor to become enlightened, to stimulate their practice, their insight. So listening to the Dhamma regularly is important for our practice, because it reminds us, brings us back to the truths that we often forget. Just as when we meditate, we often forget our meditation object, because we lack strong mindfulness, we haven't trained enough. In the same way, we forget the Dhamma. So we listen to more Dhamma, and one way we describe somebody who's reached the end of the path, reached enlightenment, is somebody who's listened well, a savaka. Listened to the Dhamma, but then applied the Dhamma in practice, which is what we're doing here. And recollecting death and reminding ourselves of the impermanence of life helps, because it helps us to let go of other stuff that clogs our mind, confuses us, distracts us, or makes us heedless. Buddhist teachings are full of opposites. So apamada, heedfulness, is the opposite of pamada, heedlessness. And you could describe one way of looking at this practice is that you're cultivating the quality of heedfulness all the time and abandoning heedlessness as much as possible. So even something as desperate as hearing that there's 4 huge mountains bearing down on you, you can, even that, which sounds a bit worrisome, depressing, just like the thought of death or the onset of death, we can actually use that knowledge or that image to our advantage. So like the king, you have the image of the four mountains coming. Well, that makes you heedful that you have to use your final moments to practice the Dhamma and bring up skillful states of mind. Try harder. And we all know one of our biggest obstacles, especially in the beginning of practice, is we don't try very hard. We try hard for a little bit and then we give up or set it aside or get distracted. But when you really consider the fact that death is slowly moving towards us, or may even be quickly moving towards us because we don't always know, that breaks through some of this inconsistency in our effort and laziness and distractedness, and it makes us try a bit harder. So whether it's your own reflection, recollecting death, or listening to Dhamma teachings, the idea is to keep bringing up heedfulness and the urgency to practice, to make that central to our life, central to what we're doing. Maybe we've already had an insight into that really everything else is peripheral to the practice. It doesn't mean to say other things you do in life are not totally unimportant or you shouldn't do them. We might still have to look after family or work or do things, other activities that are good for ourselves, good for others, but with an attitude of urgency. That's the important thing, with an attitude of heedfulness as we go through our life, to be aware that maybe this is the very last day of our life, the last moment of our life. Maybe this is the last Dhamma talk I ever give, the last breath I practice with mindfulness, breathing in, breathing out. Who knows? We just don't know what lies ahead. And life is like an opportunity to practice. As I mentioned earlier, life and death is a process, so Buddhists tend to be quite optimistic because they feel like, well, if they haven't achieved enlightenment this life through the practice, well, the process will continue, the body falls apart at death, and then consciousness arises somewhere else, and maybe there's a chance to just carry on practicing next life. But it's not sure, is it? We really don't know what will happen in this process. We may have the confidence there's a process there in place and that consciousness will arise somewhere else after death. But exactly where, we don't know. We can't predict. We're not that good, we're not that mindful and not that wise. So it's quite possible we won't have a good opportunity like we have now in this life, right now, right here, right now. We might be reborn in a place where we don't hear the Dhamma or don't have access to the Dhamma or can't practice it conveniently. We just don't know. But what we do know is this life, we're here now, we have heard the Dhamma, so we should really set our minds on the practice right here, right now. And keep bringing up that reflection every day. So one way we do that is hearing the Dhamma and reflecting on the Dhamma and the importance of our practice to make ourselves heedful. Then in a more specific way, practicing mindfulness and particularly what we call formal meditation, sitting and walking meditation, cultivating that as a regular practice. Because that's where you're really changing things for the better. You're really affecting this process for the better by giving it good inputs and what we call the practice of right effort, one of the path factors. Giving rise to the causes that will bring up skillful states of mind that haven't yet arisen, and then maintaining and developing those skillful states of mind that have already arisen. And the other part of right effort, preventing unskillful states of mind that haven't arisen yet, preventing them from arising. Or if they have arisen, then abandoning them. And the best way to do that, or the most effective way to do that, is to cultivate sati and sampajanya, mindfulness, clear awareness, regularly, to improve the sharpness and the clarity of your awareness directed back to your own mind. In the teachings of the Buddha, this is where your heedfulness, hearing the Dhamma, reflecting on the Dhamma, should lead you to cultivating mindfulness. And most likely that's done through sitting and walking meditation. Now, of course, you can be mindful in any posture, of course, but the way we really practice it most intensely and probably best is sitting and walking meditation. So our reflection on heedfulness and bringing up heedfulness leads directly on to do more meditation, do more sitting, do more walking, go on more retreats, whether it's joining other people or just for yourself, do it more. But it doesn't necessarily mean giving up many hours a day. I mean, it can be at first just 10 or 15 minutes a day of sincere mindfulness practice. Maybe cultivating mindfulness of breathing, of the breath, but done sincerely and regularly, just in the same way as we exercise the body, exercising the mind to bring up the mindfulness and to practice letting go of these things we call the 5 hindrances. Sensual desire, ill will, dullness, sleepiness, laziness of mind, restlessness and agitation and worry, and skeptical doubt. These 5 hindrances. We can only abandon them through cultivating the qualities of mindfulness and then some clear comprehension and wisdom, panya. To recognize them for what they are, to recognize a hindrance as a hindrance. Because so often one of our biggest obstacles in practice is that we're deluded, so we just run with the hindrance when it arises, we just go with it, we believe it, we follow it, we hold on to it, we think it, we become it, and it blocks us from being truly heedful and mindful in that moment. And we're just so used to doing that, we're so used to following the hindrances that we really need to practice sometimes to go against them, to say no, to let them go. And that's where this formal meditation comes in. And committing yourself, dedicating yourself to periods of formal sitting and walking so that you can improve your mindfulness. Because in the end, strong mindfulness is what overcomes the hindrances. We use wisdom as well, understanding as well, but whenever there's a moment of mindfulness, say if you're practicing mindfulness of breathing, whenever the mind is with the breath, and there's full awareness of the breath, there won't be a hindrance there. And they can't exist together. And here we are cultivating right effort, developing this process of the practice of abandoning suffering, you could say. And that means establishing the mindfulness, which is the main tool to drive out the hindrances, to abandon the hindrances. But as we practice more, we also gain experience, understanding and wisdom that also helps us to recognize hindrances and see them more clearly for what they are, see them quicker, and even preempt them. As you get wiser, sometimes you change your lifestyle as you practice meditation, even if it's only 10 or 15 minutes a day. Over time, you'll find that leads to some lifestyle changes because you'll naturally become more aware of what sort of situations, activities, behaviors feed the hindrances. So if you know something stimulates your sensual desire, and particularly in a way that, where it just overcomes your mind, weakens your mindfulness, your wisdom, in a way that feeds the hindrances, well, maybe you just decide, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to pursue that particular activity. Or if I have to, if it's something that I have to be involved with, well, I'll be very careful because I know it's stimulating a sensual desire, for example. So perhaps one of my first understandings of this was drinking alcohol. I was a child of the 70s where everyone drunk is just normal. Perhaps these days people are smarter, I don't know, and there's also more choice. People don't just drink, there's more recreational drugs around as well. But in the 70s, everyone seemed to drink, it was just normal, drink alcohol. And even meditators, when I joined my first meditation group, it was always amusing to see at the end, half of the group, it was a large meditation group, sometimes 40, 50 people. At the end, half of them would go straight into the bar and start drinking. I thought, oh, this is no good, because when you go into the bar and start drinking, it stimulates sensuality. The very thing you've just been sitting there letting go of as you meditate on the breath. Then you go away and you start stimulating it again, because when you drink, you tend to be off your guard. You become lightheaded, you relax, but in a way where you're not very mindful. So then your sensuality increases. And the self-control of desires for this, for that, weakens. So basically you go back to square one, or even beyond square one, you go to a negative region, go back further than you need to. And I could see myself doing that, so I stopped. I gave up drinking as soon as I started meditating. I just found it didn't work, didn't go together. But some of my friends didn't, so I noticed, on the one hand they're meditating, on the other hand drinking and socializing with alcohol. And so after a while I realized they're probably not going to get very deep into their meditation. It's not a criticism, it's just an observation. That's the way it is, isn't it? Alcohol is one thing that stimulates sensuality in your speech, your actions, what you do. That's just one example. But these 5 hindrances we're dealing with when we're practicing mindfulness, they come up in so many ways. Another one very common is in dullness. As we put effort into practicing mindfulness, we can do it for a while, but then our effort slips, and sometimes just the stillness of the body, the relaxation of the body, and the falling off of our effort. We lose awareness of the impending death with these 4 mountains that would normally stimulate a bit of effort and urgency. We forget the 4 mountains, and the mind just slips into dullness, sleepiness. Maybe the feelings of tiredness in the body, or habitual lack of mindfulness means the mind slips away into dullness. And that can be another hindrance that's quite difficult to overcome. But we have to work with this. And that's why I recommend in the beginning just practicing meditation for a shorter period of time, like 10 or 15 minutes, but done regularly every day. Because in that 10 or 15 minutes you really put your heart into it, really try. I don't mean force your mind so that you make yourself miserable or bring up a lot of aversion, which often happens when we try too hard or with too much desire. But just putting sincere effort into being mindful and setting aside all other mental business during that period. And doing that at least once a day, every day. Even when you're feeling ill or particularly tired from a busy day, to still put effort in for 10 or 15 minutes just to sit, cultivate mindfulness. This is the way your mind will improve, the consistency of mindfulness. And this will also be supporting this quality of heedfulness, because heedfulness also arises not just out of being fully insightful into all the teachings of the Buddha or into deep states of samadhi. It also comes about just through the effort you make in the practice. And the effort you make may not yet be bearing much obvious fruit. You might say, oh, I tried so hard in my meditation, put so much effort in, but I'm not feeling peaceful. Or I'm still plagued by lots of thoughts. That doesn't matter so much as having that sincere effort. It's the effort that is starting to affect change in your mind. That's what will bring results, and that makes you heedful, because as you put that effort in, you're noticing your mind, and even different negative mind states that bother you or make your mind agitated, restless, sleepy, angry. All these things we call the 5 hindrances. You're noticing them, and you're making that effort to abandon them. Even if you can't abandon them yet, the wholesome effort is such a powerful kind of good karma, it will bring results already. And especially if you do that every day, you'll see mentally just your alertness, your awareness throughout your day will improve. And of course, over time, there's more opportunity for your mind's mental energy to gather together in samadhi, in the continuous presence of mindfulness and wholesome states of mind is what leads to samadhi. And the hindrances disappear for a while. They take a rest, take a hike, and you're left with the good stuff. Mindfulness, clarity, some understanding, relaxation of body and mind, tranquility of body and mind, and maybe even strong feelings of rapture or happiness sometimes will arise. Ajahn Chah used to talk in the typical way of forest monks. He'd talk about 3 kinds of samadhi. Technically this is from the commentaries. You won't find them in the words of the Buddha, but so many meditation masters talk about these 3 levels of samadhi. They seem to be quite useful ways to discuss the progress of the mind and the development of the mind. So we still use them. So you say, well, if your mind gathers together after your efforts of bringing up mindfulness, abandoning these 5 hindrances, if your mind's energy gathers together for a while, maybe just for a few minutes or a short period of time, we call that momentary samadhi or kanika samadhi. And then most people find that's how things progress at first, unless they're somebody with a lot of merit and good karma from a past life. They don't go into deep states of samadhi first. They'll go into more briefer moments where the mind gathers together and becomes brighter and more peaceful. Body and mind become much lighter. Feelings of contentment are quite strong, maybe quite profound. And the hindrances seem to disappear. So, much or all of the mental chatter fades out. Much or all of the sort of desiring mind, the skeptical doubt, the wondering mind, the anxiety, agitation, the complaining mind, fault-finding mind, and the desiring mind, they all disappear for a period of time, and you notice it. You're not fooled, oh, this is good. There's a sense of relief, like getting free from some problem, like the problem of illness, or getting out of a traffic jam, or getting something that you were hoping for and it finally comes. Whatever way you want to look at it, it's like you're getting out of a problem when all the mental chatter and the hindrances drop, if only for 5 minutes, and the mind becomes really calm and peaceful. And you don't forget that, you notice that. And this is all the mental energy gathering together in momentary concentration, and even that is enough for you to have a real insight into the impermanent nature of thoughts, feelings, physical sensations, sounds, itches, painful feelings in the body, worries and anxiety, fears. Everything can disappear, at least for a while. And if it all disappears from your mind, then you know, well, it's impermanent. Because if it was permanent, it would be there all the time. But it's not. And you see that, you know that. So already what we call momentary or khanika samadhi is, it's a place where you can contemplate anicca, impermanence, very well. You can really see different parts of the mind or mental experience, mental activity fading out. And maybe, if only for a few moments, all that's left is just what we call the knowing. Just this quality of mind that is aware, but not caught up or lost in anything. It's kind of in a safe place. In momentary concentration, you may still have other sensual impingement coming to you, but it doesn't bother you. So in those few moments that you're experiencing the mind gathering together, unifying in samadhi, sounds may come up, maybe a loud sound near you of a car or an aeroplane or something. It comes to the ear, but the ear is no longer bothered by it. It doesn't lead to any kind of irritation or aversion. You just hear and then drop it because the mind's energy is gathered inside. So again, you get this sense of separation between the knowing, the internal knowing, and the sound. Or the visual image. It's quite possible there'll be visual images, even if your eyes are closed, you may have visual images arising internally. Could be light, nimittas, or people's faces, or images associated with memories. But they arise and they pass away because the mind is not craving them or reacting to them, it's just knowing and letting go. And this is such a valuable insight for us as human beings because it shows you how impermanent your experience is, and then you get a whole new perspective on things. And you know, any thought that you had that previously was bothering you or worrying you or agitating your mind, in that moment when you're experiencing even just momentary concentration, it disappears. And what disappears is not much of a threat, so you feel safe, secure, at least for a while. It's like, and we call this a refuge, an inner refuge. And some teachers even say this is like seeing the Buddha or knowing the Buddha, the internal Buddha, this quality of knowing where you're seeing impermanence, the impermanent nature of physical and mental phenomena. So even brief moments of samadhi can give you that insight. And even though it doesn't last and gradually thoughts re-emerge and painful feelings come back to bother you and all the problems of your life and the sounds and sights, taste, smell, touch, it all re-emerges and it seems like you're back to square one. But if this has come about, you've had this experience through your own efforts, mindfulness coming up, experiencing a little bit of samadhi, there's something left there. Because it's a very powerful conditioning force in the process of body and mind, the process of life, is a very powerful conditioning force, we say, a powerful kind of karma. And it can change your perspective on things, gives you a slightly new perspective, and some of that remains even after the experience of samadhi has faded. It's not like everything is lost. There'll be a little bit of wisdom or insight there that's left, and you can build on that. You can develop that further, and that will re-emerge and maybe get deeper and stronger. And then sometimes if you keep practicing and you extend the periods of time, if your meditation is improving, your mindfulness is improving, your mind settles down for longer periods, or you may experience this unification of mind in samadhi for much longer periods, like 30 minutes or 40 minutes or even an hour. And that's what they call access concentration, or access samadhi, upajjhara samadhi. Or neighborhood is the other translation. It's neighborhood. It's in the neighborhood of complete unification of mind, what we call appana samadhi or jhana. But it's not quite. So it's in the neighborhood of it, or it's the access or the threshold. It's like being on the doorstep of deeper samadhi. So in this state, the five hindrances, again, they've gone quiet. So it's a really very clear, tangible state of calm, unification of mind. The hindrances have gone, the mind is just happy in itself, not needing anything else. Very peaceful but alert, not dull and sleepy, not bored and restless. Just happy, knowing its object with the breath, emerging with the breath, and then you're just knowing the mind itself. And maybe the feelings of the body are absolutely at a minimum. And there may be some feelings of the body because it's not jhana, but it's minimal, not disturbing to you. And this is the what Ajahn Chah said, the chicken in the cage. Right, you have a chicken and you keep it in a cage, like here, around here, this area, we've got a lot of foxes. So some of the householders that keep chickens, but they keep them in a cage to stop the foxes getting them. And the chicken is in a cage so it can move around its cage, but it's safe in its cage. As long as it doesn't go outside its cage, it's safe from the foxes or anything else. This is like Upajjhara Samadhi. The mind can still think a bit, it can contemplate, it can observe arising and ceasing of phenomena, thoughts arising and ceasing. It's not completely without thought, without sounds, sights, taste, smell, touch. It may periodically go to a place where there's no more sense contact in that normal way, or there may be sense contact arising, but it doesn't bother the mind. Any thoughts that arise will be met with mindfulness and wisdom, so they remain wholesome. So that, for example, you may have a memory of an unpleasant experience arise as a train of thought or an image or a sensation, and the mind knows that, oh, that was painful, that was unpleasant, but instead of feeding hindrances and getting caught into anger and aversion, it just knows unpleasantness as unpleasantness. Oh, it's just like that. And there's a letting go, or you could say an automatic letting go. And pleasantness the same. You have a desire arise through karmic conditioning, some memory or some thought arises of something you like, but the mind doesn't grasp hold of it. There's enough awareness there and some insight to not grasp at it and take it up, to not become it. So just know it's pleasant as pleasant, unpleasant as unpleasant, but the mind doesn't grasp it. It's just watching, but not taking up. But of course, this is still what we call Upajjhara Samadhi. The mind is unified, but it's not in the deepest states of appana or jhana, so it can re-emerge very easily, very quickly. It can be thrown easily. So maybe sometimes very strong thoughts of one kind or another arise and they completely sway the mind, throw you off your object, and you come out of that state of unification quite quickly sometimes. So then you notice, oh, this is still not that firm. I've been sitting here for half an hour, very peaceful, hardly anything bothering me. I've been contemplating in arising and ceasing, and then suddenly the mind is thrown by some object of desire or aversion. So then that encourages the practitioner to say, oh, I need something better than this. And that's why one continues making the mindfulness more consistent, more firm, and may attain appana samadhi later on. And in appana samadhi, nothing can bother the mind. There are still more refined states of appana samadhi, and we know there's the 4 jhanas, which have different levels of letting go, abandoning different qualities of mind, ending up in the 4th jhana of equanimity. But we give this catch-all phrase, appana samadhi. It covers all of them, because when we're not that skilled, sometimes you're not really that sure whether it's 1st or 2nd or 3rd or 4th jhana. You just know the hindrances have gone and the mind has become very unified, and maybe for a long time, maybe for several hours, and all pain has disappeared and one's not listening and hearing things or thinking things, just knowing the object, and the factors of samadhi are there. The mind is bright, rapture is there, happiness is there. And if one was to progress from there, maybe progressively abandons some of the mental factors of samadhi until full equanimity is reached. But traditionally the teaching is that appana samadhi is desirable because when the mind withdraws from appana samadhi, contemplation of the three characteristics, impermanence, suffering, not self, is very efficient, and one can do it very well because the mind is not easily swayed or disturbed by experience. It can know experience and contemplate and see a thought arising and passing away without getting lost or sucked into it or caught up in it. Of course, if one is still not that skilled, one will always return to a state where things are bothering, the hindrances return, the mind is disturbed easily, falls into desire, falls into aversion, falls into sleepiness, dullness. It can return to that. But little by little, the whole point of the practice is that one, little by little, through experience, one is shedding attachment to different hindrances and working out how to let go of them quicker, more easily, better. So little by little, insight and understanding is deepening, and then the obstacles to meditation don't arise so easily or so strongly or so often. Less is bothering one, the less things bothering one. But it doesn't mean to say nothing bothers, but just less. And particularly in the states of appana samadhi, very close to like the experience of death, completely letting go of the body, letting go of thoughts of the past, the future. Gives a very good insight into what death is like, and then this stream of consciousness that experiences the dropping away of the body knows that, well, that's what death is. The body dies, but consciousness carries on, or certainly for one who has not reached nibbana, it carries on. It's less frightening. So somebody who's attained jhana, one of the benefits is they become less and less frightened of death, because they know death is not really the end. It's not the loss of anything other than a body which may be ill or injured or old. So one who's attained appana samadhi tends to lose their fear of death. And the mind is so peaceful and calm and happy, in that it's buoyant. It's happy enough not to feel dragged down by the sufferings of life. So it doesn't mean to say that person is completely beyond suffering. They may not be. One may attain states of samadhi long before one attains nibbana, but one's perspective changes because when one starts to see suffering as just suffering, rather than my suffering. Normally we suffer because we attach to it and identify with our suffering, our painful physical experiences, our painful mental experiences, our worries, our fears, our frustrated desires, our frustrated ambitions, our complaints and all the things that we call suffering. And normally we identify with them, but for one who's meditating regularly and practiced it to the point where they can one point or unify their mind, at least some of the time, those kinds of suffering become less of a burden to the mind, less frightening, less overwhelming. And this phrase that they use, suffering is just suffering, becomes more realistic, you understand it better. So people will go to Ajahn Chah, who was obviously speaking and teaching the Dhamma from this very high place, and they tell him all about their problems, their relationship problems, and their health problems, and their work problems, and their money problems, and their this problem, and their that problem. And they say, oh, my life is so full of suffering, I'm just suffering all the time. And he would give answers like, suffering is just suffering. Because that's really how he saw it. From the mind of non-attachment, you can say suffering is just suffering. What's the big deal? The big deal is what we make out of it. The nature of this world is that it's impermanent, suffering, not self. It's beyond our control and it's not perfect. So anyone living in the world, even an arahant, even a Buddha, experiences suffering, painful experiences. It's part and parcel of being a human being. But what changes is the mind and its relationship to suffering. When we see suffering as a noble truth, then suffering is just suffering. And when you experience the mind of the peace and happiness of, say, appana samadhi, then coming out of that, the mind can say quite honestly, oh, suffering is just suffering, no big deal, let it go. And you just keep letting go. Sure, some suffering will re-emerge, but the attitude is now established, what we call right view is established. And the right view towards suffering is, oh, suffering is just suffering. Just know it and don't make a, as Ajahn Sumedho used to say, don't make a problem out of it. Or Luang Por Chah says, just see suffering as just suffering. That's all it is. No big deal, no big problem. I know when we're suffering and we're caught up in it, it's hard to say that. And somebody who says that, you might say, oh, they're not sympathetic, they're not compassionate. But really, they're giving you the highest teaching. Someone like Ajahn Chah is always giving the highest teaching, something to aspire to, rather than giving you some false teaching where it says, oh, it's not really suffering, or try to deny it or hide it or cover it over. He'd be very honest, but not to hurt people's feelings, but simply to give them the highest reflection. Suffering is suffering. That's what it is. And the nature of this world is bound up, mixed up with suffering. If you have a human body, you're going to get some pain, some disappointments, some frustrations. Because human bodies don't do what we want. But if you have that insight, this inner peace and the insight, then you understand, oh, it's just the way it is. And ultimately, even a body is to be let go of. So somebody who's experienced that in their meditation, then the fear of pain, suffering, sickness, death starts to fade. Maybe not all in one go, but at least gradually it will fade. That's why one who attains samadhi, gradually they lose fear. Because they realize the things they fear are not really a threat, it's not really the problem. The fear is the problem, not the object of the fear. Not the nasty person or the nasty disease or the four mountains that are closing in on me. It's the mind of fear is the problem, not the object. So the mind becomes much happier like that, understanding, oh, just let go of this fear. And to let go of fear, you have to see fear, as suffering. Oh, it's another creation of the mind, let it go. And when mindfulness is there and insight is there, you can do that. If you can't do it, then that's the challenge, isn't it? Why am I still getting caught into my fears? Why am I still worrying about this thing that I've been worrying about for the last 40, 50 years, however old you are? Sometimes we're so good at worrying and fearing and being anxious about stuff, we just got used to it. And it's almost like if you could let it go, it'd be like there'd be nothing left to fill the mind. And you think, oh, there'd be nothing left. I need my fears and worries. I've got to have something to worry about. How many people do you know like that? Or maybe you're the one. You just got to have something to worry about. If it's not this, it's that. If it's not what's coming up tomorrow, or your loved ones, your parent, your child, or your friend, we've all got to have something to worry about. We love to worry. We're worriers. Obviously, some people worry more than others, but we've all got it in there to some extent. But when you see worry as suffering, you realize that that's what we have to let go of. Worry is just worry, let it go. When did worry ever help you? It only makes things worse. It's like buying a sauce that is like very unpleasant tasting sauce and putting it on your food. So every time you put the sauce on, your food tastes terrible. But all you have to do is stop putting the sauce on. You don't have to taste that bad taste. All you have to do is let go of your worries, and things improve straight away. So these are the kind of insights we get from practicing mindfulness, developing these states of samadhi, whether it's momentary or access samadhi or deep states of appana samadhi, jhana. Keep practicing, and little by little your insight and understanding will improve. So maybe for tonight I'll leave the talk there, just say this much, and afterwards there'll be a chance to ask some questions.